Hey everybody, my name's Frances and my educational giant is Noah Webster, who's a pretty awesome dude. One of my favorite quotes, actually by Webster himself, happens to be in this book, and it says, "If my name is a terror to evildoers, mention it." That pretty much sums up Noah Webster pretty well. He was a stubborn, arrogant, intelligent, patient, hard-working man who liked to get things done and didn't like, to dawdle or not do anything at all. He was born in West Hartford, Connecticut, and came from a very long line of people associated with early American history. One of his forefathers was actually a Puritan who dealt with John Cotton and Anne Hutchins and all that, which is pretty cool. He went to elementary school and secondary school, and education was very, very important for his family. However, the schools were not so good. They were poorly built, they didn't have lots of funds. In fact, in his elementary school, there were only 3 books that he read. Thomas Dilworth's spelling book, the New England Primer, which we've read about and learned about, and the Bible, of course. After going through elementary school and secondary school, he eventually made his way to Yale, which wasn't quite the university we know today. It had lots of the same problems as the elementary schools. It was small, underfunded. The students kind of were a little rambunctious, not that that's changed any. But while he was at Yale, the Revolutionary War happened. And he and a bunch of his classmates actually got together at one point and made a small company because they had lots of pride and they really wanted to do what was best for the country. Eventually, Webster joined the Continental Army with his dad and brothers because they had joined up previously. His dad actually eventually became a captain of the Continental Army, which is pretty cool. Upon graduation, he was completely broke. His dad had actually gone into debt to pay for his Yale time, and Webster didn't know what he was going to do, so he went to teaching. Like we learned about, young men who didn't have much money became teachers. So he got his first teaching job in spring 1779 at the Brick Schoolhouse in Hartford, Connecticut, which is a little ways away from his hometown, but pretty close still. He noticed a lot of problems in elementary schools. When he noticed it, he wrote a bunch of articles talking about all the problems and the solutions, and at this point, he was only a year out of school. He was 21 years old, and he was already writing articles about all this stuff. He spent a lot of his early life before he got married, moving around from school to school and from profession to profession. Over the course of a few years, he opened a few schools, like you do, and he tried out being a lawyer too, but he always went back to education in the end. In his later life, he became very, very involved in our country. Once America had independence, he wrote article after article about how our nation should join together and become its own thing and break away from Great Britain. He talked about a lot of the Enlightenment ideals. He really wanted to create a utopia in this new nation where everything would just be better. And he really wanted a separate American identity, culture, and society from England. And he thought the best way to do this was to change the schooling. He said that we were too reliant upon English books and English methods and everything. He thought we should do it our own American way. At this time, he wrote a few books, including The Blue-Backed Speller, otherwise known as The American Spelling Book, containing an easy standard of pronunciation, being the first part of a grammatical institute of the English language. That was the title. And it was just a speller book for elementary school students, and I guess students everywhere, to learn how to correctly spell words and pronounce them. It was a rewrite of the speller book that he had actually used as an elementary school child. It was a pretty cool book, and he had a few reasons for writing it. He wanted to simplify and unify the language. He wanted to teach religious and moral principles. And he wanted to foster patriotism in the new students, make them really, really excited about being Americans and create a unique culture. And actually, a really, really interesting thing about this is one of the first instances of Z-E-E, being used to pronounce our 26th letter of the alphabet instead of Z-E-D, like how Canadians say it, Z. So he is actually really instrumental in our pronunciation of our language. Over the course of his life, he wrote a bunch of other things. I'm not going to list them all because there are a lot of them. But he wrote about how we should stop using Latin rules to govern our own language. At this time, a lot of scholars and grammatical people were saying that we should input Latin rules, since it was like the purest language, onto English. But Webster was like, hold up, no, we should not do that, because it just doesn't make sense. English isn't Latin, Latin isn't English. English should have its own rules. And he also wrote the dictionary. He actually started the dictionary in about 1800, and it took him nearly 30 years to complete it, which that's a long time. And the dictionary, his Webster's Dictionary, is actually one of the reasons why people still know his name. Oop, that was the wrong page. At this point, everyone thought he was pretty crazy for wanting to do an English dictionary, because they were like, why do we need to do this? We already have Johnson's Dictionary. We can't improve on Johnson's Dictionary. Johnson's Dictionary is the best. And actually, one guy, I don't remember who it is, said, in a word, I would compare the present labors of Mr. Webster to that of a maniac gardener, who, instead of endeavoring to clear his garden of weeds, in opposing to reason, entwines them with his flowers. So people were like, why is he doing this? This is just insane. But Webster did it anyway, and he had some really, actually awesome comebacks for all of his critics. He said, as it would be as difficult for me to corrupt and debase the language as it is for him to improve it. So Webster obviously didn't back down when he had anybody question him or say that he was doing things wrong. He knew what he was doing, and he thought it was right, and so he did it. He married in 1789 Rebecca Greenleaf, and they had 8 kids, and I just think this is really cool because all but one of his kids outlived him, which was really, really rare in those days. He had 6 girls and 2 boys. The girls' names were Emily, Frances, which is the best name, Harriet, Mary, Eliza, and Louisa. And he had 2 boys, William and Henry. And he worked really hard on making sure both his girls and his boys were well educated. And at one point, he realized there wasn't a school good enough for his oldest daughter, Emily. And so he created his own one, and then he wrote a bunch of books for it, including the Elements of Useful Knowledge, which is like an encyclopedia or something. So the impact Noah Webster had on me is that I admire him for his good and bad traits so much. He was pompous, he was arrogant, stubborn, and very impatient with people, but on the other hand, he was incredibly patient with his work. He spent 30 years writing one book, the dictionary. He was unwilling to give up. He was a loving father and husband, and he was a fierce believer in the power of language and the change it could create, which is completely awesome and really influences me and makes me think that I can do stuff too. Because if he could do all this change, what's stopping me from doing it? And Noah Webster had a huge impact on the world. He really helped to create the American identity and what makes us so different from the rest of the world. And he helped create our language too. It's still English, but it's distinctly different than British English. And perhaps the thing that, is relevant enough to this course is that he bettered American schools. He saw a deficiency in grammar and spelling, and he decided, you know what? I am going to write books. I'm going to fix that. He didn't wait around for someone else to do it. He did it himself. And he believed in all forms of education, which is super cool. He knew that secular education was important, but he also believed that religious education was probably even more important. Overall, the world is a very different place because of Noah Webster, and in my opinion, it's way better. Thanks for listening.